So, in light of the recent conflicts in the Middle East, and really this goes way beyond uh, those conflicts, I wanted to read you, to whom it may concern, something I wrote about these sort of broad scale um, sort of social and political movements. So without further ado, I'll get into it, and I'll be commenting on parts of it, like illuminating things that might be kind of opaque to people. So here we go. One interesting thing I found recently is the concept of militarist and popularist systems of universalist theocracy. So, for those of you who don't know what at least 4 or 5 big words in there mean, I'll go into it. Let us assume that the Reformation and the Enlightenment are not philosophically orthogonal, but are instead parts of the same continuum. Okay, so what I'm referring to there is obviously the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment of the 1700s in Europe. So the Protestant Reformation was a time period in Europe where you have the Catholic sort of hegemony, and it splits into a more Protestant denomination. And what that basically means is that you have this giant efflorescence of Christian thinking where you had very recently, and up until that time period, you had a single sort of ritualistic government entity who was basically controlling the vast majority of what could be thought about the Christian doctrine. And during the Protestant Reformation, one of the biggest things that happened was because of the printing press, people could get the Bible in English, which was their commonly spoken language, whereas all the priests basically used Latin. So there was this difference in power between individual people and the church, and the theocratic church, which you can argue about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it did happen. So what I mean by philosophically orthogonal is they don't conflict. So what a lot of people will say about the Reformation versus the Enlightenment is that the Reformation was sort of a medieval project, and that the Enlightenment was a progressive project. But what is progressing exactly? What I'm saying is that line, that arrow of progress, that zeitgeist, goes straight through the Reformation, through the Middle Ages, and into the Enlightenment. It's the same process. Let's keep reading. The continuum, so that's that arrow of progress, goes from a liturgical mode of Judeo-Christian worship to a pietist mode of the same. So the Catholic Church is what I would consider a liturgical entity. It's charismatic, it's ritualistic, it's dogmatic. The pietist mode of Christian worship, or Judeo-Christian worship, the Protestant mode of thinking, or the Reformed Judaism, Reformed Jew, unorthodox Jew mode of thinking, is it values an individualistic relationship with God or the universe, as we'll come to in a second, and while still keeping the doctrines of the core Christian doctrines of liberty, fraternity, and equality. But you have an individual relationship, not a mediated relationship through a governmental charismatic authority. At a certain point on the pietist dimension, so that's that individualistic, basically liberal dimension of Christian thought, one could expect that the individualistic and introspective praxis of the pietists would result in a liberalizing, secularizing, and socializing of the state of public opinion. So what that basically means is that, like I just said, when you go far enough down the individualist road, you got your individual relationship with God, what you end up getting into is you don't really need God anymore because you have an individual relationship with the structure of being, and you end up in a secularized space with all of the fervor of, like, let's say a Protestant sect like the Evangelicals or the Puritans. So you end up as a secular Puritan, which is essentially what I would consider modern day liberalism. Because, like, let's say a universalist church, you will find people in a universalist church who don't really care about whether um, God exists or how many gods there are. They don't care about that. What they care about is um, fraternism, the idea that all men are created equal. Liberty, the idea that you should do what you want as long as you don't hurt anybody, etc., etc. So basically, when you go down the Protestant route, you get to the Enlightenment, which is a secularizing and a socializing of things. And the socializing thing is incredibly important because in order to enforce liberty and equality, you need to grow the state. And the state is not always a good entity. So, anyway, one would expect this to infiltrate the political and educational system of the day in much the same way that Catholicism and Protestantism were ubiquitous in the education and government of Europe. So what that basically means is that people's belief systems, the majority belief system tends to replicate itself in academia and the government. So no surprises there. All the most prosperous memes have a political, social, and educational step in the transmission process. Self-evident. When the Pietist tradition achieved full control during the time of the French and American Revolutions, the value system was already firmly understood. Liberty, equality, fraternity, I've already said that. So basically the concept that the Christian concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity were retained even after the idea of God was mocked and derided by people like Richard Dawkins, who's effectively a Puritan atheist, which is like in the same category as a flightless bird, like a penguin or an ostrich. They don't conflict. Being an atheist and a Puritan is like being a flightless bird, like it clearly exists. The only remaining question was how to set up a government to defend and replicate the values of Pietism, which is basically liberalism or humanism. The Cold War created a split between what I would call the populist method of Pietist government and the militarist method of Pietist government. And I will explain those shortly. The populist method uses a carefully tailored method of public opinion and a two-party system with real but negligible differences in opinion. If there were to ever be a candidate who sought to return to, say, a liturgist system of government, or even a pietist but militarist system of governance, like they have in Russia or China, he would have to run on a third-party ticket against significant media opposition. You can see how the two-party system prevents real change from happening. So basically, the two-party system is a false battle between two very, very similar strains of pietism. It would be like if you ran against your brother for political office, but either way, your family still wins. That's going to be important for the next page. The popularist and militarist strain of pietism have a range of advantages and disadvantages. The populist strain's wider freedom of opinion and thought means greater economic prosperity over time, but also makes it substantially more vulnerable to propaganda. As an aside, I didn't write this down, but one effect of that is that as propaganda becomes more ubiquitous, you can expect the populist strain, which is basically the United States, what is broadly called the West, to become more militaristic over time. So that's just something to watch out for. The militarist advantages are mostly inverted versions of the populist advantages. So basically they have less economic freedom, which you can see in the GDP of Eastern countries being roughly half that or less of the Western GDP. But they are less vulnerable to propaganda, so they're a more unified force. So that is an advantage. It's important to realize that these viewpoints are cousins and that no matter who wins the populist-militarist war, the general family of pietist progressivism will emerge victorious with all of its flaws and delusions. So you can see that the Israel-Palestine conflict is actually an extension of the populist militarist division within this strain of effectively Judeo-Christian universalism. So Palestine would obviously be the militarist strain, and Israel would be the populist strain. And I think it's an echo of what I was talking about in the previous video of the symbols of the culture war between basically like Sun/Jupiter and Saturn as symbols. You can go back and watch that video if you want it to be explained in further detail. But the important thing to realize is that this battle between populism and militarism is actually not really a battle. In the same way that the two-party system is not really a battle. Of course, there are real people on the ground who are being hurt for it, but at the end of the day, the same family of memes will basically emerge victorious, and it's that same family of memes that got us into this conflict in the first place. Now, if you think that there's no better alternative to this sort of liberty, equality, fraternity, either backed up by force or backed up by media and popular opinion and democracy, then, maybe this is unfortunate but avoidable. But if you could think of a better system, then perhaps these whole things could be sidestepped. Just a thought.